Good day around the world, everybody. Welcome to another edition of The Paradigm Shift Show, the business of communications in a semantic web. Today's show discussion: are we all just narrators writing reality? I'll turn it over to your hosts, Alex Ricky Gonzalez and David Amerlin. Hey, Alex, how you doing today?
I'm good. I'm really good. I'm so glad that we are back in action. We took a month off because the month of August was just crazy, but we're back now in September, and I'm so happy to see David again. David, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, it's been great, and I think the layoff probably did us a world of good. We were able to perhaps recharge a little bit.
A little bit. I like that you added the a little bit. That's, that's necessary, but I do have my go-to recharger with me, so it, it should go over well. We already have some people in the audience. I see Amelia Hoskins, Fairy Naz. Is that how she says her name?
I
Right?
think so, yeah,
I
yeah,
am
and
always worried
it's
I'm gonna say
Persian.
it wrong.
I realize Irene, but it's very Persian, isn't it? It's very romantic, really, in
It
its
is.
sound.
Yeah, yeah. And Gina Fidel said that she would be here. I'm pretty sure Cheryl Deuce is somewhere out there. So thanks, guys, for joining us and the rest of you that I haven't seen yet pop up in the stream. We are talking about narratives, which has kind of become, I'm scared to say a buzzword in Google Plus, but it seems like it's becoming a little bit more popular. So I thought that it would be interesting to talk about what the narrative paradigm is, at least in the world of communication. And then we'll move into, of course, as we always do, what it means for business in the paradigm shift we see today. So, John, do you have my first image available?
Yes, I do.
All right, awesome. So I am starting from the beginning. The narrative paradigm was developed by Walter Fisher between 1984 and 1985. He is still alive and kicking, so don't think that he's, passed on. He's still working with this paradigm and the theory that kind of developed out of it. And basically, he said that storytelling is the most basic and universal of all human activities. And he thought that we could look at all of our communicative activities through this idea that we are natural storytellers, that we like to fit everything into the frame of a story. There, I said frame. I knew it was going to come up. I knew it. So, this is the basic idea that we comprehend everything in our lives through a series of narratives. So, we have these specific narratives, like right now, this is going to end up being a narrative within the overall narrative of my life. So, we have these small stories that fit into a larger story that ends up being our entire lives. And he basically said that there are two things that we look for when we're looking for narrative rationality. So anytime that we see a narrative developing, we want to understand if it's if it actually fits the story structure. And the two things that we look for are coherence and fidelity. Coherence is basically the integrity of the story, how consistent the plot line is, how much detail there is, how reliable the characters are. Just think of any time you look at a story, and if something seems a little out of place, sometimes we'll say, "Oh, that was a really bad novel," because maybe a character popped out of nowhere and we were like, where did that come from? That didn't fit the plot line. That didn't fit the story. The second piece is the fidelity piece. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, but that's the underlying truthfulness of the story. And that's really looking at the values that the story gives us, that we see they're either explicit or implicit. But if we see a value through the narrative, we want to make sure that the story fits those values, that the individuals in the story fit those values, and that the narrative overall fits that particular value. So if we don't see coherence or we don't see fidelity, we won't see narrative rationality, which means that we won't accept the narrative that is given to us. So that's like, the academic mumbo jumbo behind this concept of we see everything as a story. We see our lives as a story. We tend to lean towards, as I told David in the green room, I am currently reading The Black Swan because it was assigned to me. And he even mentions, I mean, he mentions it in almost a negative way, but he mentions that we like to cling to this idea of everything fits a narrative. And if it doesn't fit a narrative, we tend to make it fit a narrative because we want it to so badly. He said he uses cause as the bad word. Cause is the bad word, which is really interesting. So obviously, this has application for businesses, as I think we see it used a lot more when people are saying, you know, find your narrative for your business. But I think where this conversation could get interesting is when we try to figure out how a business fits into the narrative of the consumer. What do you think, David?
Whoa, well, first of all, I love the way you presented all this. I think it's brilliant because the framing of how you put it together allows all the pieces to fall into place. And really the question is, why do we need narrative at all? I mean, at the end of the day, business is based on finding the satisfying a need, and it's based on facts. You know, you need a black box, and I have a black box. Is it square? Yes, it is. Do you need a square one? Well, there you go. If all these things fit, we don't need to dress it up in any other way. But the reason we need a narrative is because as people, we're very bad at processing facts, and we're also very bad at actually connecting through facts because they're too dispassionate and we're not usually in a position to assess them. So what we do assess is the emotional impact of everything, whether it's a brand or a business. If it doesn't resonate with us, then we're unlikely to connect, and if we don't connect, we're unlikely to do business with them. And this is exactly where narrative actually comes in a business sense, because a narrative, although it is created through a succession of factors joined together, actually flows through emotional touch points, which is where the plot line comes in. It has highs and lows, and we tend to remember those because they're the ones that resonate. And when you create a narrative in a business sense, essentially what you're doing is you're using semiotic shorthand, and I will explain this in a second, to connect the consumer. And how do you do that? Well, instead of actually detailing every single bit you do as a business, which should make the consumer want to do business with you, you find the touch points which are common to both of you. And in that sort of frame, you create a storyline, if we can call it that, which allows the consumer to fill in the bits, which then identify that person with your business. So it's all about shared values and shared journey and shared approach to how the world fits into place and everybody else fits into that. And
I
the only
like
way
it. I like that you bring up resonance though. If we can go back to that, because this idea of values, this idea of fidelity, I think really goes back to this idea of resonance, of your narrative really resonating with your consumers.
yes, and really, I mean, that's any kind of business that needs to be in business, and that's every kind of business, really needs to find how to approach its consumer base on a very human stroke emotional level, as opposed to a dispassionate stroke fact driven level. So, you know, if we buy a television, for instance, yes, the specifications are important, but also we need to feel that buy is satisfying an emotional need for something else than just owning a television. Whether we want, for instance, to have really high fidelity in the picture, where 4K TV is important, or a smart TV with a lot of connectivity, or something else. So these things actually satisfy a lifestyle need as opposed to a factual need to have a television to connect with a news feed or to watch a film. So this is how narrative begins to become emotionally driven as opposed to fact driven. And in order for that to happen, a company, really, any kind of business, needs to find its own identity. And identity itself is part of a narrative. I mean, as people and as businesses, identity is not fixed. It's part of an ever-evolving narrative that has a particular resonance or particular clarification in time and space right now. So if we look at any of us right now, me, you, and those people watching us, we are us this instant. An hour from now will be subtly different. 10 years from now will be different again. So this is part of the ever-evolving story of us, which you mentioned earlier.
So if we're ever evolving, and I know that this is going to hit on stuff that Manny just loves to talk about, but if we're ever evolving, and this is actually something that I brought up with Gina with the Sunday read that you posted this last Sunday. If we're constantly evolving, how do we maintain the values within our narrative?
Okay, I mean, this is both easy to answer and difficult at the same time, because essentially, the moment we don't talk about facts, and facts are things which we can all agree on, we begin to get into the human connection. And values are always a social construct, like ethics in many ways. So a business which works in a social setting, it works with its community, it shares that social space, needs to have shared values which arise from the commonality of needs, commonality of purpose, and perhaps commonality of overall long-term goal. And the moment a business actually does that, it becomes an integrated part of the community, which allows it to be sustainable and actually do good as well as do business. And this is how the evolution goes on, because society itself evolves constantly, and perhaps our sense of what is ethical and what constitutes a value is also subtly changing all the time, although perhaps we would like to think that these things are absolute, so they always have been the case, but they haven't. I mean, if we look at history, things which we did in the past, like segregation, for instance, where if you were a person of color, you couldn't use a restaurant which was for whites, because perhaps there's a fear factor or social contamination approach, which is ridiculous if you think about it, but at the time it was acceptable. So this is perhaps a graphic example of how we evolve relatively quickly in this century.
Okay. Okay. That I like that you talked about ethics because I touch on ethics with my students and I always tell them it it changes with context, but I never talk about how they change over time. But it depends on our experiences, right? When we have certain experiences, they can change the way that we see things, especially ethically. I mean, I think about segregation, if you actually met someone like if I met someone of color and I originally thought segregation was the right thing to do, and I met them and I realized that the segregation wasn't ethical, that it wasn't necessary for the two of us to be separated, then my ethical framework changes. So
Yeah,
that's a
exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned experience. I mean, I always put it as it's a case of data. The more hard data we have, the more we're likely to change. And in the absence of data, what we have is theory. And theory is easy to manufacture because it's untested. So we can say, for instance, that, and they used to think that anybody of color was not of the same intelligence as somebody white. Totally ridiculous and totally unscientific. But it was accepted dogma because there was no data to support it or to support its opposite. The moment you have facts, then the moment you have data, you're beginning to process things differently. The context changes, the granularity of the situation changes, and then you subtly evolve. And whether you evolve willingly or not, you do evolve because society evolves because of that.
so that actually that just sent me in a totally new direction. I have all of these comments from people, first of all, about the YouTube video not being an event. I'm so sorry. Totally my fault. I blanked out on it. I did put it in there now, though, guys. So if you want to go back to the event page, go for it. I'm really sorry, but it's in there now. So you're not too far behind. Don't worry. But that really got me, that sent me in this direction of, so our values resonate. We'll just take a business narrative, for example. My values in my business narrative resonate with my audience, and then down the road I find out those were kind of unethical.
Well, let's talk about that actually, because in the last century we had Enron, for instance, which pretty much pillaged the planet in a sense. But if we look at the traditional sense of a business, it was the values that they had was that it had to make money, it had to be good for its owner and shareholders, and those were its ethical guidelines in terms of moving forward. And within that, gradually, we saw society beginning to constrain and restrain that approach, which I would call rampant capitalism, which is churn and burn. And we began to see a more human face to businesses gradually. And now we're in full flow. We actually realize that any kind of business is embedded in a community, which is embedded in a society, which is embedded in the world. And all these things are now connected. It cannot happen in a silo. No man or no business is an island. And suddenly that changes the entire conversation, which means that it changes the way we approach things. You don't want businesses to die because they generate goods, which we need, and also jobs, which are necessary. At the same time, you don't want them to be some kind of monolithic juggernaut that walks over everybody simply because you can. So there's a dynamic there, which is part of an ongoing subtle conversation between businesses and consumers, businesses and society, which is essentially the narrative which is driving us forward. And if we look at businesses today, right now, this instant, in 2014, we're talking about social conscience, we're talking about social rights, we're talking about sustainable business models. And 14 years ago, just at the cusp of the 20th century, that would have sounded like some sort of airy fairy tree hugging kind of philosophy. And now it's very much part of the business development courses that MBA students cover in order to be able to function in a business world, in the business world of the 21st century.
So that actually, I have I've been watching this. I didn't really participate, but I should because I'm a Kent State student. But I don't know if you saw it. It was all over everything that I see because again, I'm a Kent State student. But recently, Urban Outfitters made a sweater that they were selling for like $130, and it had Kent State University on it, and they made it look bloodstained. The Kent State population, a lot of the Ohio population in general, were in an uproar. They were so mad. Yesterday they did a wear your gold and blue with pride day because of this particular thing that Urban Outfitters did. Now, I did see in the news that they issued a formal apology and they took down the sweater. But when we're talking about this narrative, I feel like for at least the Ohio population, that is now a part of their business narrative. That is now a part of not just their narrative, but how their narrative fits into each Ohio individual's narrative. So how do they move past something like that? I mean, they issued an apology, but I don't feel like people are letting it go.
Probably not. And Urban Outfitters have always pushed the envelope. They're always a bit edgy. And if you're edgy from a business point of view, you will more than likely have quite a few fails in your resume, which is what happened in this case. But I'm very glad you brought this up because this very much fits in what the narrative we're actually describing here. And if we look at how this is moving forward, well, at least in Ohio, it's become part of the perception of a company in a social setting and how it's evolving and will have to evolve, the ethics and approach in the community that's actually servicing with its services. And this becomes part of the evolution. Part of Urban Outfitters will learn from this, which means part of the company will change. Internally, they will change a little bit until they make the next mistake, pretty much like we do as people. And that's fine. We cannot expect companies to be completely right because it's almost impossible. We are not completely right all the time as people. But we do expect them to evolve. We do expect them to learn. We do expect them to respond. And provided they do all that, then eventually there will be forgiveness and recuperation and recovery, and it'll be business as usual for a while until the next crisis. And again, that's pretty much like the human narrative that we see throughout anybody's life. You make mistakes, you recover from them, learn, become better until your next mistake.
Yeah, okay. So we need to accept the business's fault as long as they show that they learned from it. But the interesting thing is, I mean, I feel like they put up that sweater with the with a capitalist value, do you think that they are now reevaluating their values?
Well, it would be great to say that every time a business trips up like that, it goes back to the drawing board and learns a very basic lesson which allows it to change its DNA. In reality, and I see this all the time, it very rarely happens that way. Yes, a lesson is learned. Depending on the severity of the problem is also how deeply that lesson is learned for the future. Usually the problem is not as severe as it appears. They recover from it, they go on, and then they make the same mistake or a very similar mistake further down the road. But the main point which I would like to focus on here is that actually they're evolving, and they're evolving as part of a dynamic between what are clear business needs, which is to make money, get market share, become edgy, and differentiate yourself from everybody else, and the very real needs of a community which has sensitivities and sensibilities which are non-commercial in tone. And that again drives into this kind of narrative which we talk about in the 21st century, where it really is a shared journey, a shared storyline perhaps. Everything that happens in the community now becomes part of the business storyline or journey or rationale or ethos sometimes. And everything that happens in business also impacts upon the community and changes and drives that. And higher perhaps consumers will be a little less forgiving for a while, which is again part of the emotional impact point. And urban outfitters will have to work twice as hard to gain them back.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing,
No,
in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is exactly what we talk about. What we're talking about when we talk about developing and evolving ethics and shared values in a social setting. Now, traditionally and historically, society has always had that, but businesses didn't, because they were always a little bit isolated and a little bit compartmentalized, and the touch points weren't as many. They're usually a transactional touch point at the customer business interface. That customer business interface now has changed completely. It is a lot more diverse, it has a greater impact, it is a lot more visible to everybody else. So a single transaction between a company and a consumer is never a single transaction between a company and a consumer. It is essentially pretty much a symbolic transaction between what the company stands for and how it will treat every consumer. And that is a significant shift in perception, which changes the narrative, changes the storyline, changes how you frame everything, which leads then back to that soul searching, how to define your identity, how to find your values, and then reach out to those you're trying to do business with through that common shared space.
All right, before we move on to this kind of actually goes into my next question. What is with the names, guys? Volker Harbeck?
Yes.
Does he say Volker? Is that German? Because then it would be.
I think it is, yeah.
Okay, so isn't this United Colors of Benetton 1980s revived? I wasn't alive in the 1980s. Fun fact.
Well,
David?
see, I remember how radical the United Colors of Benetton campaign actually was, because it reminded us that business is multifaceted, inclusive, and informed by many different strands and storylines. And at the time it was so radical that everybody else thought, oh wow, aren't Benetton so cool? And there's a cool factor to it. We're now in the 21st century. It's very much that. If you're not all-inclusive, if you're not human, if you're not connecting, if you're not empathic, if you're not prepared to listen, understand, respond, and then evolve, you're not going to be able to do business for very much longer.
Yeah, absolutely. John, I'm seeing some stuff about the audio. Todd says via VPN I can get audio with a slight delay. Fairy Naz mentioned that the audio is kind of low, so just because you're the one that does the tech, not moi, not my
Appreciate all the comments. I'm working on it.
Okay, thank you, John. I love this particular comment from Yassine. I loved how everybody tried to help everybody in order to watch this video. human beings can adjust and be helpful for the same purpose, apparently. This is a nice story. That is a nice story.
It's very true. And Yassine, actually, I've met Yassine in Paris last time I was there, and he has an incredible grasp of the essentials of Google Plus and the human connection. And I do wish he actually gets more involved in the streams and makes more connections, because I think his perception and his insights are very valuable. And he's right. We all sort of pull together when we want something to happen. We all are invested in it, or when we know each other, or we feel we're in a community, which allows us to operate in that kind of fashion.
I got a comment from Dina. Holy crap, you weren't alive in the 80s. No, no, I wasn't.
I'm laughing so hard.
No, guys, 1990, that's when I was born. I get made fun of not knowing anything about the 80s a lot. So, yeah, that's a part of my personal narrative. I'm a 90s kid. Oh, okay. Question from Todd. And Todd, I'm so glad that you are here live, and I'm glad that you directed this towards David and not me. One minor question for you, David, or a series of. When one considers that narratives are derived from dynamically evolving and exponentially tied streams of data, how does one really make any factually based observations when only complex or compartmentalized theories are being repeatedly presented or turned ad nauseum? That's a really good question. Did we just freeze?
We may have just lost David,
Uh-oh.
so we'll carry on until I see him come back. Yeah, he dropped out.
Uh-oh. Okay, well, I'm not going to try to answer Todd's question because David's going to do it so much more justice. I do have a question for Todd though, since you're out there, because you seem like someone that would read The Black Swan. Did you read it? Because then I'll pick your brain too. Oh, there, David's back.
I'm back. The
Yay.
connection seems to have dropped. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll repeat the question.
One second, I have to reset David.
Okay. Well, can I read the question while you do that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so one minor question for you, David, or series of, when one considers that narratives are derived from dynamically evolving and exponentially tied streams of data, how does one really make any factually based observations when only complex or compartmentalized theories/narratives are being repeatedly presented or turned ad nauseum? And that is such a great question. I was like, I'm going to wait for David to come back and answer it.
Isn't it just? I mean, Todd is right. I mean, there's always a danger that we can get caught up in our own awareness of the incomplete nature of data we have when we make decisions, or we make or we create any kind of storyline, that we can get into this kind of decision paralysis, and we don't do anything in fear of doing the wrong thing. And at the end of the day, what saves us is context. And the moment we contextualize anything, the parameters under which we operate are severely constrained, and then things become a lot more doable. I must also add here that any kind of contextual situation in terms of business must also be informed by the longer picture, which is why you usually need some kind of narrative structure to see where you're going, because that is what informs your ethos. So if we consider that context drives action, like I need to make a sale right now and you need this and I need the money, so I'm going to sell it to you, even if though perhaps it may not be the right thing for you. Then the long-term sustainability of the business holds me back perhaps, and I'm thinking, hey, I can say, Todd, I can sell you this car, but it only has 3 wheels. So maybe it's not the best thing for you right now. And then you can make a better decision. So it's this kind of dynamic. And Todd is right. The more we're aware of the things which we don't know, the more perhaps reluctant we are to forge forward. But that shouldn't stop us. And historically, it never has.
Yes, as human beings, we push through everything.
As people, we have very narrow bandwidth. So basically, the amount of information we process at any time is very much narrative driven. So we sort of feel we're going the right direction. It's roughly the right thing to do, and that's what saves us. And this brings us back to the need for narrative. We don't process facts and data in such a really complicated and detailed way, but we do process storylines.
Absolutely. I love this comment from Gina. Guess that wasn't a minor question, Todd. Since
That's right. Saved by a glitch. Right?
Love that. Amelia Hoskins added a link. They did have a radical campaign at the time. Lots of their images are here. So thank you, Amelia, for adding a little bit of context for those of us not alive in the 80s. There was another.
I must say, I'm very glad Amelia brought this up because, after a while, it should be mentioned that the United Colors of Benetton campaign actually lost its impact and power because it didn't actually materialize into any further action. There was not a lot of corroborative evidence of the company being as affirmative in its marketing and its sales and its recruitment as it was in its advertising. So something which started off as a great idea and became a great talking point then was deprecated into a clever marketing stunt, which eventually petered out, which is a shame. But again, it shows the need for real narrative now as opposed to the veneer which we can put on anything.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, there are so many comments coming in right now, but guys, we are at the half hour. That went so fast as usual. But I do see that Griswold left me a question, and I'll definitely get to that, Griswold Grimm, because it's a good question about hosting HOAs and whether or not they align narratives. So that'll be a fun one to answer. But I want to thank all of you for being here, and of course, keep the comment stream going. That's the best part of these shows. As fun as it is for me and David to sit here and have a chat and for me to pick his brain for a book I have to read, it's great for us to see all of you interacting with each other afterwards and us jumping in when we can. So, David, thank you so much for joining me again. So great to see you. And, of course, we'll be back in a month. I haven't decided what theory we'll be discussing. So if anyone has, if anyone's like, I really want to talk about this, drop it in the comment stream. I'll consider it, depending how much I know about it and how much I can find out about it. All right, John, take us out.
Take care.
Will do. And remember, nothing from the 80s for Alex, please.
No, you know what? Give me an 80s education. That is my task to you, my audience. Give me an 80s education. Give me a narrative for the 80s.
All right, there you go. In the comment stream, help her understand the 80s. So that'll be interesting.
It will be.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of the Paradigm Shift Show, the business of communications in a semantic web. Today's show was about narrators. Are we all just narrators writing reality? Join us in a month for another awesome episode. Thank you.